That's bad. It makes us look desperate. They can probably all hear us now too.
They can hear you now. Yes.
Yeah.
They're like, what a bunch of losers those guys are.
All right, you guys, we're on. So, thank you all for joining the Crowdcast author event here with Nick and Andrew. I'm Dave Lucy of Page 158 Books in Wake Forest, North Carolina. We would love to someday welcome all of you to our store. Hopefully, we'll be able to open our sales floor up again sometime soon. A couple of quick housekeeping items. There's a chat panel on the right-hand side of the video feed. You can use that to communicate with me or other attendees before, during, and I guess kind of after the event, but I don't know who's going to be hanging around after. There's a Q&A tab at the bottom of the video feed. You can submit questions and you can upvote questions that other people have submitted. And after the author presentation, we're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes to do Q&A. But you can feel free to enter your questions whenever you have them. We probably just won't answer them right away. And I would just want to remind everybody who's not listening on headphones that this is live, so swears could happen. And I'm not going to say that they're going to come from Nick, but they're probably going to come from Nick. We are really thrilled to host Andrew Altschul and Nick Flynn. Nick is a best-selling poet, memoirist, and screenplay writer. His latest book, Stay, presents a self-portrait via a constellation of topics that the author has circled or have circled him in his work: suicide, homelessness, addiction, political engagement, and artistic friendships. It was released on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, by Z Books. Andrew is the author of the novels Lady Lazarus and Deus Ex Machina, his latest novel from our friends over at Melville House. A shout out to Dennis and Val. The Gringa is a fictional account of the real-life events surrounding American activist Lori Berenson, who spent 15 years in a Peruvian prison for aiding leftist rebels. It is riveting. I love this quote from author David Shields. What every even slightly conscious American writer is trying to figure out right now is how to write about the state of America without clambering atop a soapbox. This is the considerable achievement of Andrew Altschul's The Gringa. Both Andrew and Nick's books are available for purchase using the Buy Books link button below the video. Click on that button, scroll down the page, you'll see them. And we might be able to convince Nick and Andrew to sign some book plates for us that we can include in your order. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Andrew and Nick. And I am going to hopefully disappear here. There you go.
He's gone.
Hey.
Hey, Nick.
You're going to introduce me, and then I read, and then I introduce you? Is that it?
Or? Yeah, he already did the intro. I don't really have the bio handy, so I'll just introduce really one of my favorite working poets in America, author of, what is it now, 12 books? Or the 12th is coming this summer, right? Something like that. Memoirs, poetry, screenplays, and if you haven't read Nick's books, please buy some of them today. And I can't think of a nicer guy to do an event with. So, Nick Flynn.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm glad Andrew asked me to do this, and I'm really this is our second virtual event, the only two I've done so far, and it's really, I'll do anything you ask me to do, really. We did something 7 years ago, I think, for your last book, right? We do a Q&A, or we did a discussion?
It was 9 years ago, and I think we did.
At Powerhouse. I'm remembering Powerhouse.
In Brooklyn, and the captain asked for a show of hands came out like a few weeks before Deus Ex Machina, and we did the same thing. Read some fiction, and then we just kind of talked.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah.
Huh.
Cool. And here we are again. Here we are.
I feel like I should take myself off the screen while you're reading.
Okay.
Dave was going to do that. I'm a little scared to do it. Nope, he did.
He's off the screen. Okay, I'm going to share my screen also with you all. Let me see if I can do that. I'm going to read from my book, Stay, which we heard. I'm going to read for a few minutes. I'm going to read passages of it. I'm going to show you a PDF of it, but it sort of looks like this inside. There's many pages that it's very designy, different types. The subtitle is Threads, Conversations, and Collaborations. It's chronicles my past 30 years of collaborations with other artists, but also it samples all the books I've written, and how they sort of tie together and speak to each other, but how they're also in communication, in conversation with many artist friends. There's about at least 30 artists in here that are dear to me, that a lot of the work came out of or is in conversation with. So I'm going to show my screen. I'm going to share the book for you so you can see the pages of it. Let's see if that works. Let me see here. Let me try to do this. Share, and then do this. Tell me if this is going to work. I want to make a full screen.
Yep, we got it.
That looks pretty good. Okay, so I'll read for a few minutes from different pages of this. This is early on in the book. And it also includes some collages that I've done over the years also. This is a thing I do when I'm, sometimes when I'm writing, sometimes when I'm not writing. And I'll talk about it a little bit here. There's a little essay on that, on ephemera. When I find myself in a new city or town, at least until I know where I am, I give myself a daily task. Each day I must locate 3, sometimes more, pieces of ephemera, a scrap of paper, a gum wrapper, a shopping list, a child's drawing, with the intention of making a collage. Ideally, I will finish the collage by the end of the day, and the next day I will begin a new one. To call what I'm looking for trash is accurate, as it is usually something that has been discarded, hopefully even walked on, definitely exposed to weather, but not for too long. I like the effect of weather on paper, how it seems to contain time. I don't pick through trash bins. I have to find it underfoot. I'll spend the whole day searching for these 3 scraps with a simultaneous task of finding a piece of cardboard to arrange them on. I also have to locate a stationery store where I can buy rubber cement or a glue stick. It's preferable if the cardboard has an image printed on it, a label indicating what the box once held, oranges or safety pins, a number or a logo. The scavenger hunt helps me get through the first day or week. I get to know the city this way. I get to find out where or who or what I am. That was first published in a journal called Nowhere in 2008. Okay, I'll shift to the next one here. See how they do. We're going to go to get to see a little bit of the book as I scroll through it. This is my dear friend Mark Adams. He took one of my books, The Ticking is the Bomb, and he painted on it. He painted on the pages. That was our collaboration. So I'll read this little essay. It's called On Purchase. In my first book, I had a poem coming from my mother's point of view and a poem coming from the bullet's point of view. I was trying to take different routes up the mountain, attempting to find different purchase on the material. Purchase. So many ways up that mountain feel uncomfortable, but I've come to trust that discomfort is a dowsing rod for where the water is. It's like in a dream where something bad is happening behind a door. You have to choose to either turn away or to open the door. And it seems for poets, or for any artist, or maybe for any human being, it just seems like maybe you should open the door. But you should only open it when you're able to. You might not be in shape at that moment, psychically, spiritually, whatever, to open the door. You might need a few years of whatever it is you do to make yourself healthy before you're able to open that door. You might have to leave the door closed for a while, which I think is a perfectly valid choice. Let's move on to another one. It's one of my favorite pages. One of the things I noticed when putting it together is very design. I got to work with a designer. The press is called Z Books, and the editor of Z Books, Michael Zilka, set me up with a designer, a design studio, and we got to sit for like half a year figuring out layout of the book. And this is one of my favorite pages because it's just sort of the juxtaposition of the 2 images, which had never gone together and weren't together in my subconscious, even when I wrote, or maybe in my subconscious they were when I wrote it. That's my mother on the one side, a picture of her when she was about the age my daughter was when I began writing what turned into this book. And on the other side is a poem I wrote for my second book of poems called Hive. So I'll read that. I'll read the poem Hive. hive. What would you do inside me? You would be utterly lost. Labyrinthine comb, each corridor identical. A funhouse there, a bridge, worker knit to worker, a span you can't cross. On the other side, the queen, a fortune of honey. Once we filled an entire house with it, built the comb between floorboard and joist, slowly at first. The constant buzz kept the owners awake, then louder, until honey began to seep from the walls, swell the door frames. Our gift. They had to burn the house down to rid us. I forgot to mention that those poems are all in various voices. That was in the voice of a beehive, which is a strange phenomenon. It's very strange to just read, to sit in your room reading alone. You never know who's listening. Then we'll go to this one. Let me see. Yeah, let's go to this one. This is another Mark Adams, another page of the book that he did. Maybe I will, I'm going to show you this one. I'm going to go to another one. Looking at my time, I'm thinking of, I'm going to show this one. This is one of the last entries into the book. This is Zoe Leonard, a friend of mine. She and I were friends in back in our 20s when I lived on a boat in Provincetown, and Zoe ended up living for a summer on the boat. And then I would follow her work over the years, and she just had a show, a retrospective at the Whitney. But when she was taking this photograph, I was writing Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, and I went and saw her studio. And I'm not really sure how deeply this image sunk into my my conscious mind, but in the subconscious, this is one of the passages from Another Bullshit Night in Suck City. So I decided to put them together, sort of a subconscious collaboration. I look in his eyes as he speaks. Somehow I'd learned to do that, like a tree learns to swallow barbed wire. I'm going to read one more passage, if that's okay, and then we'll move on. Oh, this could be a ways away. We're getting there. You're getting to see the whole book and sort of scrolling by. It's like your life just passing before your eyes.
You got plenty of time.
Oh, there is someone there. Okay. Okay, this will be the last one I'll read. This is a collaboration I've done with my daughter. So she would have been about 5 years old at this point. We would make these collages together. There was several years where that was sort of one of our activities. We just sort of make collages together. So I'll start. I'll read the manifesto. Manifesto. Early on, I began looking for people I could work with, anyone to help me with my projects. Though what those projects might be was utterly inchoate to me, unformed, uncontainable, incomprehensible. In college, I set a typewriter up in my dorm room. Anyone who entered that room had to spend some time on it. You had to make something, leave something. I was trying to know what was essentially unknowable, what it is like to be someone else, what the interior life is like for you. This is an idea I continue to wrestle with. All right, and I'll end there. Thanks, everybody.
I keep looking for the button to put the little hand clapping symbols up, but that's on Zoom, which is where I seem to spend most of my time these days. I don't think Crowdcast has one of those, but that was fantastic, Nick. Thank you.
Oh, cool. Were the images visible? Could you actually see the images?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, they're absolutely visible. Now I'm just looking for this platform is new to me. Oh, there we go. Full screen. That was what I wanted. So I'm so excited to talk about Stay and I Will Destroy You, your collection of poems that came out last fall that I almost want to skip my own reading, but I guess I shouldn't do that.
No, don't do that. No.
Yeah. I'm at least partly here to read and talk about my new book, which is called The Gringa, and it came out from Melville House on March 10th, which was the day before the pandemic was declared. So really exquisite timing on my part. And it is, as Dave mentioned, it's based on the story of an American woman who was arrested in Peru in the mid-90s and convicted of terrorism and treason, and spent 15 years in a military prison before she was paroled in 2010. And the book concerns itself partly with what did or didn't happen in Peru that led up to her arrest and trial. But it also tries to kind of excavate who this person is, this white privileged American woman who, suddenly turns up in a house full of leftist guerrillas in Latin America. And so the narrator of the story, who's an American expat, kind of a layabout failed writer named Andres, he's trying to put together some portrait of her based on very little evidence. And so I'm going to read a section where he has kind of reconstructed her college career. I mean, he tries to get into her childhood and her young adulthood and figure out how she came to the politics that she did, how she got radicalized, if that's what happened. So this is an incident that takes place during her senior year of college at Stanford, on the eve of the first Gulf War, George H.W. Bush's invasion of Kuwait to expel Iraqi forces. The character's name is Leonora Gelb. And the only other character that you really need to know about in this section is she had been dating a graduate student named Marden, who he lives in a house in Oakland with what appears to be a kind of like neo Black Panther cell, and they had broken up, but she ran into him at a sit-in on campus the night before this scene, and they kind of hooked up again or something like that. And at the end of their liaison, he asked her, he said, whose side are you on? Are you on anybody's side? And that's where we'll pick up. In San Francisco's Civic Center the next day, she followed Marden through a crowd of thousands, a surly and liquid mass that swelled and shifted, insinuating itself between buildings, swamping police lines, thumping drums and clanging pots and pans in an endless rattle that set the nerves on edge. The weather had cleared, the sky packed with fist-shaped clouds that wheeled around City Hall's gold dome. Speakers shouted into bullhorns, cursing President Bush and the oil companies. Signs stabbed the air. Stop the madness. Fags against war. An eye for an eye does not equal justice. As waves of outrage rolled through the plaza in deep orgasmic shudders. She hadn't eaten. Hunger and the buzz of coffee brought a sweat to her hairline. Unshowered under her long-sleeved shirt, she could smell her own slightly horsey scent mixed with his sharp musk. She was supposed to be in the library, working on an art history paper. While the bombs fell, while innocent people were maimed and incinerated, she was supposed to write a paper on Caravaggio. Unthinkable. She knew this was how most people lived, by somehow finding ways to write papers on Caravaggio while children in other countries were murdered. But Leonora would not be like most people. If you're doing this, you got to be ready, Marden said at dawn. He told her to wear black, to take off her rings, leave her ID at home. They'd taken the train from Palo Alto, and Leo practiced glaring at well-dressed commuters until they turned away. As the sun moved behind the stately buildings, the undertow shifted toward Market Street and the financial district. The crowd was still growing, fed by side streets, a cacophony of car horns met by angry howls. Leo's pulse banged in her head. Cops in riot gear lined the sidewalks, cries of pig and fascist, followed by the crack of glass bottles against plastic shields, metal thuds as bodies were thrown across the hoods of cars. Marden pulled her through the current and into a courtyard where a dozen men and women clustered nervously. A pink-faced teenager with a shaved head and full-sleeve tattoos handed out ski masks. Leo clutched hers in both hands and looked at Martin. "You can still go home," he said. "Vamonos," the tattooed kid said. As they neared Powell Street, the crowd barely moving, Leo kept her eyes on Martin's back. Into her head came a litany of things she needed to do, the Caravaggio paper, another on Plath and Sexton. It was her turn to clean the co-op kitchen. Her father's birthday was next week, and she still hadn't bought him a gift. Her stomach hardened into a hot nut. Children were going to die for no reason, she reminded herself. What did Renaissance art matter? A few feet away, a naked woman painted with blue and orange flames hurled herself at a policeman. "You fucking murderers! You fucking baby killers!" The cop barely got his shield up in time. 3 others grabbed the woman's flailing limbs, and she growled deep in her throat and spat at one cop's face mask, and he pulled a canister from his belt and sprayed her in the eyes. Leo felt herself duck, felt something whiz overhead, and then a great shattering as the window of a shoe store evaporated. Her mind whirled. This was the real thing, not a lecture, not a photograph. She looked up at the surrounding office buildings where tiny faces watched the melee from dozens of windows. She couldn't imagine what they saw. "Wait," Leo said, snatching at Martin's sleeve. He shrugged her off. The air was suddenly bitter with smoke. "Where are we going?" But he was already forging ahead. Someone handed her a length of heavy pipe, and then they were pushed apart by a riptide of bodies in skin-tight skeleton suits who rushed across the street, leaping onto cars and barreled full force into the police line. At the next intersection, the Chevron building soared skyward out of a cloud of white smoke like the space shuttle on its launch pad. Its gilded revolving doors were guarded by an arc of police cruisers and orange water barrels, beyond which was mayhem, cops and protesters colliding, spinning in pairs as if it were a lurid high school dance. A fire engine edged forward, its sides crawling with people. She couldn't find Martin, couldn't breathe through the smell of gasoline. The pipe hung heavy at her side. A surge in the crowd knocked her off balance, and when she righted herself, they were sprinting past, a dozen bodies in black masks smashing into the cops with loud grunts and the clamor of metal on pavement, and then she was running after them, struggling to get closer to those golden doors. She could hear herself screaming. She stumbled and went down, and a pile of bodies fell on top of her and rolled and quickly scattered. There was another explosion. There were cops on the ground. She could hear the thud of clubs against soft tissue, taste filthy copper on her tongue. As she climbed to her feet, a skeleton-suited body fell into her, and she shoved him back with an animal cry and shook herself free. Step by step, she pushed forward, dazzled by flames, until she was only a dozen yards from the revolving doors. When the smoke briefly cleared, she saw a body on the ground, set upon by 5 cops, one of whom tore off the attacker's mask, while the rest slammed nightsticks at his limbs, drove the butts into his belly, and kicked at his ribs. She couldn't move. The sirens wailed, and the man on the ground curled up and rolled side to side, but she couldn't make herself move forward. And when the cop holding the mask took a running step and aimed his boot at Martin's head, Leo dropped the pipe she was still holding and ran. Eyes streaming, she elbowed across the current, stumbled on bottles and bricks, and tripped at the curb, tearing the flesh from her palms as she fell. She dodged through a gap in the police line and headed away from Market Street, at each intersection turning from smoke and noise into the eerie stillness of downtown. She could hear herself panting, whimpering. She stopped on a dark corner to pull off the mask and retch hot mucus into a trash can. A fire engine screamed past, and she started running again. In Union Square, there were cops everywhere, lining every sidewalk. She wiped her nose, spat in the gutter, and ducked into the first set of doors, to stand blinking and heaving in the crystal white light of Macy's perfume department. Later that night, the war would begin. Baghdad lit up with tracer fire, glowing submarine green on CNN, the silent and unreal world of alien life forms doomed to extinction. There would be tomcats and prowlers, hellfire and scuds, bombs that found their targets and bombs that found something else. Human shields, Abrams tanks, retreating Iraqi soldiers slaughtered from the air. There would be stories about U.S. arms sold to Saddam, doctored satellite photos, PR firms paid to invent Iraqi atrocities. And through it all, you could hear the chatter of Wolf Blitzer and Bernie Shaw, the stern compassion of Tom Brokaw, and the bland assurances of the president, who that first night explained to us there are things worth fighting for. But in this moment, There was only the chilly light of the showroom, the tick and buzz of fluorescence, the whispers of other customers when they caught sight of the girl in black with a livid face and bleeding hands. Is there something I can help you with? A skinny saleswoman stood flanked by two coworkers. They closed ranks at the Chanel counter, trying to maintain their staged elegance like figures in a Nagel sketch that someone is about to burn. No, I'm... Leah was shaky-kneed, her blood pounding. Police cars wailed past on Stockton Street, blue light fracturing across the mirrored counters. I'm okay, she said. I'm sorry, said the saleswoman, but you'll have to leave. Leo forced her breathing to slow. I'm looking for the men's department. The woman folded her arms. Willing her hand not to shake, Leo took out her Stanford Visa card from her pocket and summoned a voice learned in the shopping malls of her youth. I'm here to buy a birthday present for my father. Is there a problem? Before they could reply, she spotted the escalator and strode past the women with her chin high. She rode up 3 flights, swallowing ripples of sobs, washed her face in the ladies' room and browsed a good long time, until her eyes dried, her limbs stopped shaking, until she found the perfect gift, a silk tie, an abstract blaze of blue and red, designed, the label said, by Jerry Garcia. So that's from about halfway through Gringa. Hey, thanks, man. Can we get him back on screen? Get that guy up here.
That was great. It's so good.
Thanks, Nick. And I was thinking kind of in the back of my head when I was reading, I was doing that weird thing where your mouth is moving, but your brain is going somewhere else.
Yeah. That's not good.
Well, I mean, it's kind of fun. It's like by location, but
I was right with your mouth. I wasn't with your brain. I was with your mouth.
All right, well, that's always a better policy. Trust me.
Yeah.
But I was remembering the first time we read together. This was in 2011. I think it was the first time we met, even. I was reading from Deus Ex Machina, which is, it's a book it's a book with politics, but it's not a political book in the same way that this one is. And you were reading from the Captain Asks for a Show of Hands, which is, just remains one of my most jaw-dropping recent poetry collections. And I just remember thinking, so the year before that, The Ticking is the Bomb had come out, which dealt with what had happened in Iraq at the Abu Ghraib prison, and your own. You tripped to, I think it was Jordan, right? And you met with some of those detainees who had been abused by U.S. forces and by private contractors. And the Captain Asks for a Show of Hands deals with a lot of the same material. And I just remember thinking, like, as you were reading, that it really takes a lot of guts as an American artist to go there, right? I mean, there's so many things from our teachers, from the publishing industry itself, that they really don't want us to go there. I mean, they really, the conventional wisdom is that politics and literature, at least American literature, don't mix. And this has got to be the only country in the world, the only literary country in the world where people think that. But a lot of people really think that here. So, so that was an inspiration to me. It was really probably less than a year later, I started writing this book. And I just wanted to kind of ask you about, as a poet, as a nonfiction writer, sort of, what enabled you to go there and how you feel about it, and like what kind of sort of deals you make with yourself as an artist when you want to work this really explicitly political material into your books.
That's great. And yours is, you've really, with the Gringa, you've really gone like deeply into it. Can you hear me okay?
I went there. Yeah, I can hear you great.
Yeah, and the good news, the good part about that is, with American publishing, is that the field is wide open, because it isn't something that's, often brought in. But I think everyone at a certain point, especially these days with the I think politics has become what we do a lot. Like we especially in these last few years, but even before that, in the Bush years, and I do feel like I sort of went a little bit on cruise control under Obama. Like I'm like, okay, I don't have to pay attention anymore. The good part about having one party in over the other is that you pay more attention to the state of the world. There's more to look at. It seems like, although those things are happening under both administrations, though, like there's this stuff happening that's shady.
We never closed Guantanamo.
Never did. Yeah. There's a lot of things that went on. So, and there's so much to say about your book too. But just to jump back to like your question, when that came out, like it really was something that an examination of Abu Ghraib, and that was not something I really wanted to spend 6 years on. It wasn't a choice I made. It sort of came to me, and it was like a thing I resisted. But I kept, whenever I looked at the newspaper, whenever I listened to the news, that's sort of all I heard. It was like a strange thing. It was a filter on everything else, and all I heard was about these prisoners being tortured by U.S. Personnel in other prisons, and the country supporting it. The U.S. thinking like suddenly that's a good idea. And I was just sort of really confused by that, and really it hooked on something in my subconscious. And the book is an examination of trying to figure that out, like what it was about that, which I think is also, I know you have a personal story with the Gringa, this connection, like what it is that compels you to, because a novel is a big project, like to take it on like the years it takes, and you start going down that path. And I can totally imagine you thinking many times along the way, like, this is not what people want to read. Like, this is, like you were saying, this is wrong. This is like, a North American writer, white writer, writing about like another country and another political situation. Yeah. And how do I do this? How do I do this? And I always feel like that. Usually I feel like it's like a good sign when I feel like I'm doing something really wrong. So I think that might have been a thing. So yeah, tell us about your journey, like figure out how to, getting through that,
Yeah, I will. I wanted to just kind of give a little addendum to what you just said, which is that when I was paging through Stay last night, and Nick and I talked before this event about whether we were going to admit that neither of us has had the time yet to get all the way through each other's and we haven't, but that's fine because I can't wait to.
You just admitted it.
Yeah, I came out.
You just did it. You just admitted it. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. But there's an essay in Stay. I don't remember where it was originally published, but it's called "Here Comes the Sun," and it's about you, among other things, you going to talk to these detainees and to hear about these. I mean, they were war crimes. We could call it anything we want, war crimes. But it was while your wife was, I think, 5 or 6 months pregnant, and then it was going on through the birth of your daughter, and just the incredible sort of juxtaposition of life going on in this peaceful, privileged country we get to live in, while, like I said in that excerpt, writing papers about Caravaggio while children are being murdered in other countries, and we spend so much time in this country doing that. I mean, even when we're up in arms, even those of us who get up in arms, you can only be up in arms or marching so many hours of the day, and then we go home and we cook dinner and we binge watch television or whatever. And there's something that I can't quite wrap my head around with that. And so a lot of writing the Gringa was, my trying to understand kind of my own feelings about, really my personal or individual inadequacy in the face of, really the serial atrocities of the last 20 years, or the last 40 years, if we're talking about Peruvian history.
Last 400 years, yes.
Well, yeah, there you go. Yeah. But wanting to think about who's the person who doesn't do that, right? I mean, who's the person who doesn't write papers about Caravaggio or binge watch television or teach our classes or do whatever it is we do while children in other countries are being murdered? And I had lived in Peru for a couple of years in the late 90s. And it was a couple of years after the Laurie Berenson affair, which the novel is kind of loosely inspired. And I was always really fascinated with that character. I mean, fascinated in the sense that I was horrified. I mean, here was someone who in some ways looked a lot like me, right? I mean, she's we're the same age. She's, middle class, upper middle class, secularized Jewish woman from a New York family, good schools, had gone to MIT or whatever. And, that doesn't sound that different from my own biography. We probably have a lot of the same kind of political ideas. But when I was in Peru, I was down there just having a good time, just being that, that most gringo thing, the expat with a little bit of money in his pocket. And I just wanted to learn Spanish, go dancing, be out of the United States. And I had enough privilege where I could do that, where there was someone who was in some ways like a doppelganger for me, who, her priorities were somewhere much different and really much more admirable in some ways. But at the same time, she got herself wrapped up one way or another with people who were advocating, armed struggle, violent revolution against the government, and paid the price. I mean, spent 15 years of what was originally supposed to be a life sentence. And so I was just always fascinated with that kind of, you talk a lot about Jung in the essays in Stay. I mean, that's in some way my shadow self, right? Mm-hmm. And so the story just stayed with me, and it stayed with me all through 9/11 and the Second Gulf War and Abu Ghraib and the tremendous atrocity and abomination of the Bush administration, the Bush years, and thinking about that narrative that we heard all the time about how America had lost its innocence, and just how goddamn lucky we'd been to ever have anything that anyone could call innocence up to that point, when the rest of the world, largely because of the United States, in many cases, had never had that privilege. And so, at some point at the end of that decade, this book just started kind of popping out one way or another. And 8 years later, here it is.
It's a slippery slope, though. You got to be careful. I remember when Rebecca Solnit wrote A Paradise Built in Hell. Yeah. She had mentioned to me that she had done her, she referenced The Ticket Is the Bomb and just said like that she'd done her political thing. This was her political work. Yeah. But now she's continued doing it. That she hasn't stopped. She keeps, she's got deeper and further in. So be careful. We'll see where you are in 10 years.
I think I want to write. My next book's going to be about young post office assistants looking for love in New York or something like that. I don't know.
Maybe that Caravaggio paper. I mean, did that make it into the book? Did you actually get to read her Caravaggio paper in the book?
No, and I think she ended up with a B- in art history, and probably because she was too busy marching on the Chevron building.
The passage you read is it's like writing about taking acid or something. Like it really was visceral, like being in this moment. I've been in some protests, and just the energy of it was really, really something. Like the sustained energy just keeps going on, and the chaos and the frenzy, and it's really, really well done.
Yeah, I mean, I'll fess up and say that I was living in San Francisco for the second Iraq invasion and took part in some of the protests. Then in '91, when we first invaded Iraq, I was living in Providence, Rhode Island. I was a senior in college, and I was working for a radio station. I was just like an on-air music DJ, but when the war broke out, it was all hands on deck with the news department. And I remember going down to what's it called? I think it's called Kennedy Plaza, like sort of the main plaza of downtown. Yeah, and interviewing people, and there were protesters against the invasion, but somehow I ended up with this flag draped, tattooed Yahoo screaming in my face into this microphone going, US of fucking A, and I'm tired of the US getting its ass kicked. Let's go in there and kick somebody else's ass. And I was just like, I was 21 years old and had, barely dawned political consciousness of my own. And that moment just stuck with me, that the frenzy of it. I mean, there's a kind of there's an erotics to protest and protest that was like, you could just smell it. What can I ask about Stay? Because I'm fascinated with this book.
Of course. Yeah, sure.
Do you have the hard copy there? Because I haven't actually seen the hard copy. Yeah. So, I mean, oh, yeah, there you go.
Oh, no, wait.
Wait a minute. Which way did we go? It feels to me like I sort of imagined it being this larger object, almost like this coffee table object, because there's so many like different kinds of things, inputs in the book. I mean, it says threads, conversations, collaborations, but there's also, I mean, we saw a lot of there's graphic panels, there's excerpts from old interviews, there's magazine pieces, there's photos, drawings, there's pieces from your old books, the memoirs, the poetry. I'm not even going to get it. I'm not even going to ask you about what the Wright's nightmare must have been like, because probably no one but you or me would be interested in that. But how did was there an idea for this book, or did this book sort of like assemble itself kind of outside of your own control?
No, it had been an idea of mine for quite a while, for like at least 10 years. And I tried to get it off the ground with various people. When people would propose to me like, hey, you working on anything? I'd say, well, I have this idea for this book. I do all these collaborations with people. And it's at least 3 presses who approached me to do a project with them were like, yeah, no, do you have anything else? Like, that sounds like a bad idea. And the thing about it is probably another press might not have been able to do it. Like, this is a brand new press. Like Michael Zilka, he was a music producer in the 70s and 80s in New York, and he did like these great bands. You know, he sort of knows all the people from downtown New York in that time.
Okay.
He left the music business and went and formed an alternative energy company, and now he just got rid of that, and he just wants to do a press. So he approached me to do it. So I proposed this again, but he already had another book in line. When I looked at the book, it was sort of doing similar thing to what I was thinking of, because it's his friend Glenn O'Brien, who was also involved with visual culture. He had like a TV show, and he had a lot of different modes that he worked in. And so that was the first book. But I sort of came up with the template for my book, and maybe for the press in a way. Glenn's book is similar too. Pretty quickly, like within like a month or two, because I just had all these pieces, and I did put them together. I tried to think of what a structure would be to, why they would talk to each other. So it's broken into 6 sections, and the first section is the mother, Sleeping Beauty, the mother, and it's how various ways I've written about my mother, but also about motherhood and about just going through. And then the second section is father, ways I wrote about my father, about now me being a father. Then it gets into like sex and drugs and rock and roll, sort of this sort of like wildness of my like 20s and stuff. It gets into political stuff. There's a whole political section in it where I did various political work. So it sort of follows those. Each section follows those arcs. So that was the structure. And then the images, I wanted to show the images, like say like an image like this. This is like a dear friend of mine. He was my roommate in New York for many years, David Brody. And he and I, after we stopped living together, we ended up doing this collaboration where he was a filmmaker and he made this film and he did these drawings, and we figured out just this way to do something. And it only existed as we made like a limited edition newspaper that we sold at his opening for like $1. And that's the only, it's a real odd object, very, we only sold it for $1 because we thought if we gave it away, people would just throw it away when they left. So we thought we should charge something just so it had some value. And it just no one's ever seen it. It's like a thing. And that poem isn't in any book, and this is the only place where it exists outside of that now. So there's a lot of things like that in it, which were really important to me. Like I worked like, probably for 6 months on this project. And it only appears in a very tiny little edition. And now it's here. So there's something about that makes me happy.
There's this great way that the book that, I mean, having read many of your books, 2 of the memoirs, and I think 2 or 3 of the poetry collections, they certainly feel like they're of a piece. They certainly feel like they're the same writer. But what Stay does is like really show the way in which it's kind of all one book. That like your life and your thoughts and these themes that keep coming up. Like that's the work of art that occasionally pops out a book that's in prose or pops out a book that's in verse. But with Stay, you kind of can almost hold it all in your head in between those two covers.
Yeah. I think we're all just writing one book. I think, you and I are writing a book too, I think this is, from the vantage point of like 100 years or 1,000 years, this will be basically one book that was written.
Yeah. Could be. Yeah. I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah.
I'm seeing a little number 3 next to ask a question.
That means I got some questions from the audience. You guys ready to take some?
Ooh,
sure.
Yeah, sure. Ask away.
All right. So one thing I just wanted to throw out there real quick was that Whitney put a comment in the chat that she has a photograph of you, Nick, from 20 years ago wearing a T-shirt that says "Stay."
I saw that thing, and I have Whitney. I haven't seen you in so long. I'm so glad to see you there. And send me an email and send me the photograph because I'm pretty sure it's the. I should hold this up, and then Whitney can say whether it's the same T-shirt. Whitney, is it? Let me close this thing here. The question is,
cool.
is it that image, Whitney? Is that the image? Whitney will answer at some point.
She will. Yeah.
Like a T-shirt. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. So let's get to the questions here. So, for both Nick and Andrew, what are your thoughts on where we're headed? The good, the bad, the ugly. And Whitney has confirmed that is the T-shirt.
Headed in the world?
Yeah, where are we headed in the good, the bad, the ugly?
Why don't you start? Why don't you start with this one? I say hi to Puffkin too. Hi, Puffkin.
I spend a lot of time trying to think of silver linings. It's not necessarily my nature, but it feels necessary for survival. It's tempting to feel like the trajectory is, very clearly and very steeply downward. I mean, if you're not sure about that, just ask yourself whether, 12 years ago, at the tail end of the George W. Bush administration, whether you said to yourself, we could never have a worse president than this. Lo and behold, well, I mean, in some ways we do, in some ways we don't. At least Donald Trump hasn't yet invaded a country for no reason and killed 500,000 people. So he's got that going for him, but he's killed a lot of other people, and the death toll is still rising. So, it does start to feel sometimes like, however bad it is, there's something worse around the corner. At the same time, there are good things coming out of this period. I think one of the things is that Trump is really laying bare the reality of what one of America's two political parties has become. And I do feel like on more optimistic days that the Republican Party, as we know it, can't survive Trump. And if that is the end result of the Trump administration, then that will be a real net positive that comes out of this period. He's just making it so plain, the racism and cruelty that is the fundamental layer of the Republican Party of 2020. So maybe that means that our political discourse at some point in the not too distant future gets a little healthier, a little more sane. I don't know. Am I being too optimistic, Nick?
No. There's a place for optimism. Definitely. I mean, my fear is that, it could go many ways. There's many good things coming out of this. Even with the pandemic, the skies are clearer. We've stopped consuming as much for a moment. This horrible pain as a result of it, though, with unemployment but it would be nice to imagine that some shifting of priorities would sort of like shift the wealth, all the wealth in the country could take care of this like very relatively easily. And some of these things are happening with the bailouts and things, which theoretically we'll see what happens with it. I'm not wildly optimistic about it, but I think there's a lot of suffering right now. I know there is, and it could go. I was shocked when Trump got in some ways. And I wasn't that surprised. I teach in Houston, Texas, and so I actually wasn't as surprised. I wasn't one of those people that thought like, oh, there's no way he can get elected, because there was, outside of the bubble of New York, I could see that he had a lot of supporters, but he's always represented the worst of America. Like it really is remarkable. Like I've known of him since the '80s, and he's just a joke. He's just like incredible joke of the worst of America, and that's what we get. So we sort of get what we deserve in some way. There's some reason that he's here, and it could lead into authoritarianism, which is a very real possibility, or it could lead to some really restructuring of priorities in America, which is really necessary, whether it's Democrat or Republican. The Democrats for the last 30 years also have been driving the train on the same track in the same direction, right. But just going a little bit slower and throwing more candy off it. So so we feel a little better, like it is, and it is better under a Democrat. Like you go to a homeless shelter and things are better. Yeah. We still get the homeless shelters and they're still getting bigger, but it's not as fucking grim. But the train is still going in the same direction. The train really has to not be going in the same direction. So and this, a big thing like this could derail it, which maybe is necessary. So
the thing like this followed by, if a Democrat is elected, I mean, even if it's Joe Biden, who I've always admired Joe Biden, not that I think that he would be, a total sea change for the country, but I think he's a good person. But even to elect Joe Biden now on the wave of several years of a party that's really been driven by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, to really take a look at its own collaboration in the neoliberal economic catastrophe of the last 40 years. And so, I want to think there's going to be some chastening going on the left as well. We're going to.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
Next question. Is that good enough?
That is fantastic. Great answer. All right. So next question is for both of you. What's some of the best advice that you've received about engaging with the creative process? And that's from Sarah.
You go first, Nick.
The best advice I've received about engaging in the creative process. Well, I think just allow yourself to okay, you're asking advice I've received, so it's something I've got from someone else.
Well,
I was going to give you my own advice. I'll just give you my own advice. I can't think of anything else right now. I think that it's really important just to notice where your attention goes, like to try to sit still and notice where your attention goes and follow that. And that will lead you to what is important, what you need to create, what is it's a track into your subconscious, just to notice that. When I was doing the book we talked about, The Ticking is the Bomb, when I said I'd look at a newspaper and all I would see was the articles on torture, and I didn't choose to do that. I really tried to resist that, but at a certain point I just let that happen to see why and ask myself why. I don't even ask myself, but just follow it, and it. It was a difficult road. Sometimes those roads are difficult, but it was really worthwhile to do. So that's what I would say. Yeah.
I don't know whether I ever received this advice explicitly or rather just by accretion, but it's something along those same lines, which is just, you have to make yourself someone who insists on slowing down their world and slowing down their mind and paying attention. I have so many students, undergrads more than graduate students, but graduate students too, who, you ask them what they're reading and they say, I have so little time to read. And say, well, why do you have so little time to read? And It's because we've got 999 cable channels and streaming this and Facebook and Instagram and this and that. I mean, you know, this isn't to toot my own horn or anything, but like, this is my phone, you know, because I feel like my creative life would be over if I spent my days like looking at a screen and flickering from little fragment of this narrative to fragment of that narrative to fragment of that narrative, or at the very least, I couldn't be a novelist. I mean, I might channel it in some other direction. So, I mean, it's really about cultivating a state of mind where you can be bored sometimes and just let your mind go where it wants to go. You can get lost sometimes because you're not always like en route to the next thing, and you can let your mind sort of not only settle on the things that interest you, like Nick says, but also do that really important unconscious work of combing through it and combining it and juxtaposing it with other ideas and seeing where that takes you. And I just really have a hard time believing that that's possible for most of us the way we live now, where our attention is just, you know, in a trillion little pieces. So just taking back your own brain in some way seems to me like step one.
Just to jump on top of that, or to piggyback on that, whatever the word is, not to jump on top of it, but to stomp all over that, I have for the last like 10 years or so, like any workshop I teach, even at the university level with my grad students, there's some thread of meditation that's part of it. So we'll meet for a thing, and I'll have everyone just sit and meditate for like 7 minutes, and then do a 7-minute writing thing. And to me, the meditation is actually to me, like I realize that I think that's the best teaching I do. It's just we just sit and do nothing and just meditate for 7 minutes, and that to me is the most significant part of the writing process. The more I do it, the more I'm convinced of that. So
I'm going to steal that. That's really fantastic.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic. We probably should end on that, but there are a few more questions because that's really good. Those are really good answers from both of you. So Joe wants to know, Nick, do you have any background in making zines, and have you ever considered working in the graphic novel medium?
Well, I do know my limitations. I made a little zine for my first, before I had a book published. It took me 10 years of writing. You know, my first book came out when I was 40, and it took me 10 years of writing that book. And so I would do readings, and I got to the point where I made a zine. I got like a bunch of my artist friends, and of them, I'm trying to think of how many are in this book. I think all of them are in this book. I got about 4 or 5 of my artist friends to make art for that zine that I put together. It was incredibly labor intensive. You know, I sold it for probably $5. It probably cost 10 to make it. So it wasn't a very economical thing. But I have friends who are comic artists. So this is they're in the book. This is my friend Josh Neufeld. So I think that you know, so I could, yeah. I mean, I don't assume you're suggesting I become a comic artist, but that I may write the text for a comic artist, which I would do. It would have to sort of be the right project. Like anytime if it's the right project, if someone approached me, if Josh approached me, Josh is sort of my comic artist. I have like a composer. You know, every poet should have like a composer, a comic artist, a dancer, a filmmaker that you just work with and do things with.
I have a plumber and an electrician, and
you should have that. Every plumber should have a poet. Yeah.
Excellent. So Joe also wanted to ask both of you, what is your revision process like?
Extensive. Yeah.
I mean, it's a little bit like, you ever see like museum exhibits about like, medieval medicine, bleeding and leeching and cupping and all of that. It's a little bit like that. I mean, I think that, if there's an extent to which like I feel like pride in myself as an artist, it's in how much better I've gotten at revision over the years. I think it's typical for younger writers, probably for younger male writers more than female writers, to kind of get in that frame of mind of like, every word I wrote is precious and it's genius and the muse was speaking to me, and how dare anyone suggest that that these beautiful sentences be taken out. And I think with 3 books behind me, I've gotten to the point where I enjoy revision more than first drafts. So if revision is medieval medicine, you can imagine what the first draft process is like for me. But I love to come to, especially with something as big as a novel, to come to 300, 400, 500 pages as a giant sandbox, and decide like what I really like, what makes no sense, what can make better sense, what should make less sense, maybe to know that the raw materials are all there. And now, the cliche that Michelangelo said about sculpture, you take a huge hunk of rock and you get rid of everything that's not the sculpture. So,
right.
That's kind of, I've gotten closer to that as an ideal over time.
Nice.
That's good. I've been working on revisions with my undergrads in Houston just this past week, and we spent a full month on it. They wrote some poems. I just wanted them to revise 3 poems, and it was really, we just spent a lot of time just like looking at what it was. And often they would do the this sort of like it was like drudgery. You could see they would just go and like change an adjective or something. It just seemed like they weren't actually re-entering the work and like actually like sort of really playing with it as material and just moving things and just being wild with it. And so yeah, I'm pretty harsh on those revisions. I would just be like, you haven't done anything. Like you can't change something from fantastic to wonderful, and that makes your poem different. Like that's not really that interesting to me. And so they began talking to each other like that, like how they could do it, how you could move whole pieces around and just think of it as material, as like not as information, but as material, the language. So I really like it too. I love revision actually. It's
one little trick along those lines that I do have done a little of, but want to do a little bit more of, is to guard against exactly that feeling that Nick's describing, that way that as artists, if we see a poem that we've written, or if we see a story or even a scene that we've written and it feels done, it can feel really difficult or painful to rip it back open and go back into it. And so sometimes what I'll do is I'll leave a gap, I'll leave a flaw, I'll leave something in it that will signal to me when I come back to it, no, of course this isn't done. And then to just consider it something that is still in progress, rather than, this reified moment that can't be messed with.
And you just go back and you forget that you put that fly in. You don't just like pull it out, like you.
No, I remember. It's sort of like I mean, it's like leaving just some piece of dialogue that I didn't have at the moment, and saying, what, that's going to be where I'm going to start 2 months from now when I look at this scene again, or 2 years from now.
Like if you're building a house, you just like don't put the doors on or something, and then I see. Yeah. So it's really obvious. Like whenever you go in, like, oh, I got to put that door on. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's one in many ways. Like we have to sometimes kind of try to fool ourselves, or lure ourselves under false pretenses back into the work to make sure that it gets where it needs to go.
Nice.
Awesome. Shelby just wanted to say to Nick that she took a Omega workshop of yours in 2009, met her husband because of you.
And, hi, Shelby. I know Shelby. Hi, Shelby.
Awesome.
Yeah, I remember Shelby. She was working at Omega, I think, right? Yeah.
Could be. Well, that is about it. We're at about an hour, so we can wrap it up. I want to thank you guys both. It was fantastic. Great jobs. And I just want to I want to put in a pitch for everybody to buy their books. These are 2 authors that had books come out in the middle of a pandemic, which, as a bookseller, I mean, that's when you see books that you love and that they're not getting the eyes on them that they should in a bookstore, it's painful. And we really want to see both of these books do really well. They're both fantastic. And wish them all the success in the world with these. And they can only do that if you buy it. So buy it, give them as Christmas gifts. like I said, I'm going to see if I can get these guys to send me some book plates for the orders that have come in during the event, and I'm sure be able to ship those out pretty quickly to you. So, and thanks again, guys. Really appreciate your time in doing this, and it was just fantastic. Great stuff.
Yeah. Thanks to you, Dave, and thanks to Page 158 Books and everybody who showed up for this. I mean, talking about silver linings, if there's one little thing we can all take out of this experience, let's make sure we're buying our books from independent bookstores from now on. I mean, big discounts and overnight delivery is nice, but we need these bookstores in our communities. And so if you're going to buy Nick's books, buy my books, buy them from Page 158 or other independent bookstores. But let's make sure these stores survive this. Okay.
When I went to the climate protest back in October, my favorite sign was "The wrong Amazon is burning."
Oh, that's really good.
We'll end with that.
I might have to borrow that one.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave.